trying to do is bring people together to talk about leadership, technology, and what kind of leaders do we need to lead in a world of high technology. As technology changes, the pace accelerates, et cetera, then what are the implications for leadership? And basically the theme of my presentation here started as leadership is technology agnostic, but then most people vomit over the word agnostic because they think it has some religious connotation or something like that, or they don't like the word. But basically my point is that no matter how much technology changes, no matter how many robots we get running the world, that we are still going to have a requirement for leaders. And what I wanted to do in this presentation was outline what I think are the essential characteristics of leadership that are enduring, the things that have to be done no matter what the technology looked like 20 years ago or what the technology will look like 20 years in the future. So that's the theme of this. And so anytime you listen to somebody talk about a subject like this, you should have a little bit of background on them. So mainly because I'm in this Raleigh office, I just want to make sure that there was no doubt where my allegiance is. But this is also just to give you a touch of my personal background. On the right, that's my wife, Mary Ann, and that is not our son in the middle. But anyway, we graduated from Duke University. We met there our freshman year. We went on one date and said, "Oh, this is awful." And we got back together our senior year, and this August we'll be married 39 years. And so I'm pretty proud of that in this day and age. But so we graduated one day, we commissioned in the Air Force the next day. Mary Ann served 20 years on active duty. I think a lot of you know I served about 33 years on active duty. And then came to IronNet, and one of the co-founders, and been here for a little over 5 years, as exhibited by the 5-year plaque that I got at IronNet University. So, okay, so a lot of people wonder what I did in the Air Force, and that's what I did most of the time. I was in for 33 years, 28 years. I flew this airplane, the F-15C. It's important to denote the model because this is the one that's designed for air-to-air for shooting down other airplanes. And what we found is over the course of time, this airplane's 124-0 between us and the not us and the Iraqis. We shot down a bunch of Iraqis, but the US and the Israelis have flown this airplane since the late 70s, and it's 124-0. So it's a great airplane. We kind of put ourselves out of business. By the time we got to the second Iraq War, they were burying their airplanes in the sand, as you may recall. So I did that. And a lot of times people want to know, you know, what was your call sign, right? Because it had to be something cool like Maverick or Iceman or Killer. And so this was me. And so about the time the movie was coming out, and the movie, if you don't know, is E.T. I got to remember, I've got several generations now past this movie. But about the time the movie came out, I was a lieutenant in my squadron, and I came to be named E.T. And the more you don't want to be known as E.T., the more likely you're to be known as E.T. for the rest of your career. And in fact, there's people that don't know my real name. And so my wife had this picture painted, and in case you can't tell, that's E.T. from the neck up, and that's me from the neck down. So so then people want to know, well, how'd you go from being a boring ass fighter pilot, right, to being a really cool cyber guy, right? Because I do not look smart enough to have made that transition. I understand that. And so for those not familiar with the military, this is how it works. They give you orders, not requests, right? And so I was at Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, Japan. I was commanding, it's the Air Force's largest combat wing there, about 9,000 people in the wing, about 25,000 people in the community. And I got a call from my boss, and it was time for me to move. It was about 2 years. And he said, you are going down to PACOM, which stands for Pacific Command in Hawaii, and you're going to be the J6. And I go, this is not, you got the wrong guy on the phone, right? Because the way military staffs are organized, they're numbered. So the 1 is personnel, the 2 is intelligence, the 3 is operations, 4 is logistics, pay attention, Nick, there'll be a test. 5 is plans, and 6 is where all the cool people work. That's IT, cyber, command and control systems, all of that. And so I was on my way to be the J6. And so the way that came about was Pacific Command is what's known as a joint command. So there was a 4-star admiral that ran it, and he had responsibility, he used to like to say, for 52% of the Earth's surface. So Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Special Ops spread all over the Pacific, as you might imagine. And so he was the first of our, what we call combatant commanders, to really be vocal in saying, we have to stop looking at IT and cybersecurity and all of that stuff as a support function. It is critical to executing our mission. In fact, if I've got forces spread all over 52% of the Earth's surface and I can't get orders to them in a timely fashion, if I can't be assured that the order is going to go to the right people and not go to the wrong people, if I'm going to be assured that the order has not been manipulated or changed, right? All of that is part of these command and control systems and what became everything we do with cyber. And so what he wanted was to bring an operational view to the J6 is what his objective was. Because in his mind, the J6 people didn't really understand operations, right? And so what I found when I got into the J6 was that they understood operations. They were more than smart enough to understand operations. The problem was nobody called them in the room when you had a meeting about operations, right? They called them in the room if the video teleconference didn't work, but they didn't call them in the room when we're planning things, executing things, all of that. And so what I figured out very quickly is my job wasn't to educate the J6 people. My job was to educate all the other tank drivers, ship drivers, airplane drivers, and tell them, if you don't start getting smart on this stuff, if you don't start paying attention to how this works, then what you end up doing is you end up abrogating your responsibility. You end up delegating risk to a poor guy like Brandon, right? Who is stuck in some room with no windows, and he's making decisions on how you allocate bandwidth or how you defend your network or whatever the case may be. And he's a smart guy, but he doesn't know what the commander's priorities are, right? He doesn't know where we are in the mission, all that. So now transfer that to the private sector, and you can see we have exactly the same situation, right? For now, at least 10 years, we've had the same discussion in the private sector, that we've got to stop looking at cyber as an IT as a support function, right? What business can run without access to cyberspace? It's all about, can I get information, move information, use information to make better decisions faster than the competition? And so some of the work I've done in boardrooms and with some other speaking I've done is really what I did back in the military, where I spent most of my time talking to the 3 and 4 stars about, you got to get smart on this, right? You don't have to be an expert, but you shouldn't have a Barney style conversation, right? And Barney style is, depending on your generation, either Barney the dinosaur or Barney Fife, right? And not a lot of people know who Barney Fife is, I found out. One day I asked him Maple Lawn and like one hand went up. But the point is that, you know, if you're the CEO of a company and you've got a question about operations, you know exactly what to ask the COO and you know if the answer makes sense, right? If you got a question about finances, you know what to ask the CFO and you know if the answer makes sense. If you want to know if your network is safe, you go, hey, Dan, are we good? Right? And that's a completely different situation. So most of my time had been spent translating between the technical guys and the strategic leaders, whether that's on the business side or in the military, and trying to convince, and board members were some of the toughest, is that you got to get off your butt and spend a little bit of time understanding this, you know? And then you've got to bring in all of those technical leaders. You got to start bringing them in the meetings, because if you don't bring them in the meetings, how are they going to learn the terminology? How are they going to understand the priorities? How are they going to be able to put their issues in a business sense? Okay? So with that background, you know, I came to some conclusions. So one of them is I think that good leaders can lead any team. And I came to that conclusion through a lot of different ways. Is, you know, one is, as I grew up in the military, you know, you go from being a fighter pilot, so think of that as an individual contributor, okay, to where I was a squadron commander with 350 people, right? 50 people were the motorcycle gang, the pilots, right? But the other 300 were 18 to 24-year-old people maintaining the airplanes, right? And so that's leading a completely different group of people, right? And then as you grow up as a group commander and a wing commander, when I was at Kadena, I had a 500-person hospital. I had 1,500 civil engineers, all of that. So the military, as you get more senior, puts you in these situations where you're expected to be able to lead any team. But probably the biggest shift I had was when they sent me to be the J6, right? Instead of being the J3, the ops guy, they sent me to be the J6. So now I had a couple of challenges. Is one, you got ET walking in now, right? Flight suit, you know, looking cool, right? All that stuff. And the people that are in the J6 are going, who the hell is this guy, right? In fact, when I first got the job, my predecessor was an Army general, and outside the office at Paycom was this wall with maybe 25 pictures on it. And you know what military official photos look like, right? And they start with black and white, and then they have the color, and he goes, so you're the first Air Force guy in 28 years to have this job, and you're the first person ever who doesn't have a background in comm and IT and all that. So good luck, right? And that was about it. That was our whole changeover, right? So what I determined was that these words became really important: empathy and action. And empathy from the standpoint that I didn't have to learn how to do the job of everybody on the team, but I needed to spend enough time sitting down with them, watching them work sometimes on a keyboard, other times just spending a couple hours saying, you know, Lisa, what do you do? Tell me about it. What blockers do you have? You know, all that. Until I built confidence across this group of about, I think it was 250 people or so, that the new guy was actually interested in what we were doing, right? And understanding what our job was, understanding what the blockers were, all that sort of thing. And then the action is when they saw me very visibly representing their interests in other parts of the command, right? Because the issues that they worked with, right? If you take those 28 years of people before me, they're all comm and IT people, right? And I was just as guilty of it as everybody, right? If we had a room of fighter pilots, or we had a room of tank drivers, or we had a room of special forces people, and you bring an IT person in, you know, and George Lamont can testify to this, no matter how smart they are, no matter how well they present, you're gonna go, oh, it's just the IT guy, right? And so what I had to do was I had to change that dynamic, right? Because I would maybe come in saying the same thing that somebody like George said, but, oh, it's ET saying it. It must be important now, right? And so that's not fair, right? But that's just the way it is. But the way I was able to then use that, the action is, I spent a lot of time going around to different areas, both within our command and other places, and where I could most see it evident was in our command, where all of a sudden, you know, Kristen, who's never been called by anybody in the 3 operations or the 5 plans, all of a sudden she gets a call and they say, hey, we're having a meeting. Can you come up? We need some advice. And she's like, holy crap, how did that happen, right? But now, all of a sudden, that's put a different level of importance on her job, right? And this will come in later, right? She starts to feel a worth she hadn't felt before, right? And so that does a couple of things. One, you know, that makes her feel better that what she does is important, but now it puts her in an unfamiliar environment, right? She's got to go into a place she's maybe not comfortable with, but that forces her to grow, right? She starts learning new terminology. She starts learning new things. And then I did have to do some formal education, if you will, to J6. I was lucky I had a soldier and I had a Marine. Not lucky I had a soldier and a Marine working for me, but of the soldier, there was a particular soldier, a particular Marine, who had both taught at their respective, like war colleges, you know, the military education. So they were experts on planning and the planning process. And in the military, this planning process is very complex. There's a lot of steps. It's got to be done a certain way. But that's one of the advantages of the military. They really know how to plan. That's how we get all this crap from point A to point B and get people ready to go. And so what I had them do was run like brown bags on how to do planning. And you know what? Before long, the people in the 6 knew more about the doctrine and the process, right? Because a lot of the people dumped in the 3 and the 5 were just like me. When I left flying after 10 years to go to my first staff job, I went to work in the J5, the planning area at Central Command. I didn't have very much formal training, right? They just think you can do it because you're an operator. And so all of a sudden, now not only do they want Kristen there because she understands the J6 world, but all of a sudden she's got all the terminology. She understands the processes, and pretty soon they're asking them questions about it. So it was a very cool thing. But what it told me was the 2 important things were empathy, but it's not just enough to empathize and understand what you do. That really is important. But now I had to take actions that would help not only make you better prepared to be more effective in a broader range of areas, but I had to create that demand signal because I could get into rooms and get into meetings that my predecessor wouldn't get into. So I had to leverage that, right, in order to get the J6, the mission, why it had to be integrated, all that stuff exposed. That make sense? So empathy in action. Okay. This is a quote from a famous ROTC student. It's from my son. I was talking to their ROTC detachment one time, and for those of you who don't know, my son didn't want a real job. He's an F-16 pilot, and so he said, I don't know, leadership is vague, right? And I think that's a pretty good description, right? Because you can Google, you can read books, there's all sorts of definitions of leadership. But what is the definition of leadership? So everybody's got to have their own definition. And part of my pitch is that you lead people and you manage resources, right? And I've seen that in other places, but I remember one time I was in Tyson's not too long after I got here, talking to 3 or 4 of the software developers, and I said, because they talked about managing people, and so that's a pet peeve of mine. I said all the time, I understand what it is, but I said, you really ought to think of it as you lead people and you manage resources. And they all stopped and looked at me. They hadn't heard that, they hadn't thought of that, And it's a nuanced thing, but I think it is important because it really conveys what I think leaders have to do, which is these 3 things. I think they provide vision, I think they provide motivation, and they have to be able to deal with resources. So vision is a lot of times thought of as like the vision of the company, right? That companies and people can operate, without fear in cyberspace kind of thing. But the vision has to be translated down. Each of the team leads, right? Like Dan, I know, has a vision for what he wants his team to do, how he wants them to perform. And that vision is what gets people on board, right? Where they can see where it is we're trying to go. But the leader is not necessarily, and I would argue in most cases, not going to tell us how we're going to get there, right? What I want to provide is, this is where we're going, this is why we're all interested in it, but I don't want to tell you how to get there. And the example I used to give for this is that, if I go back to that wing in Okinawa, for example, there were 6 colonels who worked for me. I was a 1-star general, 6 colonels worked for me. And, I might know very well, I didn't know very well, how to do operations. I knew pretty well how to do maintenance, I'd learned a lot about logistics, right? But if I went in and told, the colonel, whoever it was, Colonel Nicole, and I said, here's where we're going, here's what we're doing, here's what I want you to do, A, B, C, D. Do you have any questions, right? Maybe she doesn't think A, B, C, D is the best way to get that done. Maybe she thinks 1, 2, 3, 4 is the best way to get that done. So what I would prefer to do is, unless I think 1, 2, 3, 4 is illegal, unethical, immoral, or stupid, and will absolutely not get it done, right? I'm going to have Nicole do it her way, right? Because she's invested in that. And so if she tried to do A, B, C, and D, we may get a 70% solution. If I did A, B, and C, and D, we may get a 90% solution, right? But I'm not the one doing this. It's her job. So let me give you the vision where I want to go, and then you figure out how to do it, okay? Motivation. I think that we sometimes get too wrapped around the axle on motivation as pay. Certainly your pay, your compensation is an aspect of motivation, but I think there's a lot more to motivation than that. Part of motivation is back to vision. Do I get you to buy in on the vision? Are you on this journey with me? Do you see this as important, et cetera, et cetera? Certainly pay is part of the motivation. We're going to talk about some other things in terms of you have a motivation to get better at what you do. Believe it or not, people have aspirations outside of IronNet, for example. Understanding what those motivations are, understanding that who haven't I picked on? Maybe for Desiree, she's more motivated by having flexibility with her work hours and that sort of thing, and is not as interested in compensation, or she wants time to get more education or whatever. So everybody has a different motivation, and as hard as it is, team leaders understanding those individual motivations becomes super important, because if I assume all of you all are motivated by exactly the same thing, I'm going to screw this up, right? And that's why, Dan, who's got a big team like he does, he has to have a personal understanding of everybody, because he's got to know, which knobs do I turn, because something motivates one person, something motivates the other. And then when I say resources, time, people, and money. Okay, so nobody has enough time to do everything that they've got to do. Nobody has the workforce, the full workforce that they have, that they think they need, or they're not all qualified. And nobody normally has enough money to do their job, right? And we got the same thing in this company. Does anybody have too much time? Does anybody have too many people in their team? Does anybody have more than enough money? No. So that's where the management side of leadership comes in, is being able to manage those resources. But it all is a component of leadership, and I think leaders, a good leader is by definition has to be a competent manager, but not all real competent managers, I think, are good leaders, because they don't get that vision part, they don't get the motivation right. All right. Communicate. They used to tell us, communicate, communicate, communicate. You cannot say whatever it is often enough. And you hear the same thing, you know, from Bill, for example. How many times have you heard him say, we got to move from good to great to world class, right? And those same things over and over. And the bigger your organization is, the more you've got to be, communicating those things, because you're relying on other people, right, to drop that communication down to every level, right? Because we have the ELT meetings, right? So I've got to figure out, you know, back when I had, you know, all the engineering and all those other components, you know, when we were a company of 180, I had 130 of them, you know, working for me, but only one of us is sitting in the ELT meeting. So it's my job to figure out, what are the themes, what are the messages that need to come out of there, right? And not everything that I hear in the ELT should be transmitted to everybody in the workforce, right? So I've got to figure out, how do I convey the right things at the right level and make sure that those are passed down. And then I've got to remember this, that what I said is not nearly as important as what you heard, right? Just because I said it doesn't mean that that's what you heard, okay? And so you have to figure out a way to check understanding. And sometimes it's just right at that particular meeting. You know, I'm going to sit there and say, we're going to do this, 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 this. Okay, repeat that back to me in your own words. What is it that we're going to do, right? Or more commonly, where you see this frustrated is, I'll tell you one that happened in this company about 2 years ago. Is, you know, we're going through the normal cycles we go through with, you know, we're doing well financially, we're not doing as well financially, we're doing well financially, we're not doing as well. So we started looking really close at, you know, our hiring process. And at the ELT level, we never said there's a hiring freeze, right? But what everybody heard was there's a hiring freeze, right? And what we were really trying to say was, you know, we need to focus on the essential people. We need to focus on, you know, if there's people that maybe aren't essential right now, but they're really hard to get this kind of individual, and we've got an opportunity to get them, we'll get them now. You know, but what everybody hears is there's a hiring freeze, right? And so we fought that, you know, for several months, because once they it gets out there. So as a leader, particularly the higher you are in the organization, what I found I had to do at some of the larger organizations I was in, as one, because I had done that empathy thing, right? I knew a lot of people at different levels, right? Is go in and have a conversation, you know, with Brian. And I'm not gonna go in and ask Brian, what did Dan tell you that I said at the meeting, right? I'm gonna, Brian, how you doing? How are things going? Blah, blah, blah. What do you think of this? What do you think of that? So I'm gonna ask a couple of questions just to try to get a sense for what's filtering down, you know, 2 or 3 levels below. Because being able to understand and be confident that what you communicated at the top level got especially down 2 or 3 levels in the way you wanted to is very difficult. And I would also suggest this, that when something doesn't go right, if the first thing you do as the leader is say, okay, what part of this do I own? Did I communicate this clearly? Did I make sure it was communicated clearly? I can't tell you how many times that I've been on the other end of being frustrated because I clearly heard this, boss, and that was not what the boss meant to say, okay? And so as a leader, you've really got to facilitate that, because not a lot of your direct reports are going to be willing to speak up and say, hell no, that's not what you said, you know? And that's what you think you said, okay? So what I said is not as important as what you heard, and you have to check for that. All right, feedback. I put a few things up there on feedback, and I think feedback it's just incredibly important, and it's incredibly hard from both sides. It's incredibly hard from the person that's getting it normally, and it's incredibly hard for the person that's giving it. And so I've come up with kind of these 3 components that I think that if you follow this, it starts to drive to better feedback. It's setting goals, it's informal dialogue, it's formal feedback, and it's what we've codified here at IronNet, what we're encouraging folks to do. Number one, on the goal setting, I'm not going to give you another OKR spiel or anything like that, but I don't know how how can I sit down with Alexis at the end of whatever the period is, the quarter, and give her feedback if we didn't mutually agree on what she was supposed to be doing the last 90 days. You know what I'm saying? And I got questions like that on the OKRs. People would go, how am I supposed to get my OKRs set if my manager keeps asking me to do other stuff? And so my first question is, did you and your manager sit down and agree on what stuff you were supposed to be doing this quarter, right? So if you don't set goals, whether it's a quarter, a month, a week, a year, whatever it is, your feedback cadence is going to be. If you don't have goals that you and your manager have agreed to, and think about the previous slide, when I said it's not what you heard, right? Did we 100% agree on what those goals were? Then I don't know how you can give good feedback, okay? The second one has become, they're talking about the tech world a lot everywhere. People have clearly figured out that once a year, evaluations and feedback are not working. And that's why Melissa and their team have instituted the quarterly feedback, which I think is better. But I think there's got to be even more, and that's what we try to, I know it was a pain in the butt asking everybody to check in on their OKRs once a week. I mean, I didn't expect 100% of the people to check in once a week. And really the objective is not to be perfect with the OKRs. The whole objective of that was to encourage routine dialogue with your manager, right? Where you're just hopefully once a week or once every other week that you've got some mechanism, and Quantum was good for that because it's like everybody's social media feed. You can type a couple of lines in there, whatever it is, but we're just trying to generate that routine conversation because I know several managers in particular. I'll call out Josh McDonald. I mean, he was religious about his weekly one-on-ones with his team, okay? Other managers, either they can't find time, they're not comfortable with it, it's hard to do. And so whatever you set up as a leader to do that informal dialogue is really important, right? Because one of the reasons feedback's so important or so hard to do is because we don't do it very often. So the more you can have those short conversations. And so you both have to work at this, the manager and the direct report. And these informal dialogues are the places to be really specific, right? Because feedback, hey, you're doing really good or you're doing really crappy, that's not very good feedback, right? I need to have some specifics. So, right after this meeting or right after this, code freeze or certain points, especially back to if you really know your people, right? You know what they're working on. And now you have to really tune yourself as a leader to say, oh yeah, I know that John has been working on this particular thing, so I'm going to keep my eye out for this. But that's hard, right? Because you get in this zone where you kind of know what everybody's doing, you know how everybody is. So if you don't kind of tune yourself to know what is it that John's working on, what did I tell him, at our last feedback session, and give him some specifics. Yeah, hey, this went really well. I can see you're working on that. That's getting better. Or hey, we're still not quite there. This is where we need to go, et cetera, et cetera. And this is not just from the leader to the direct report. The direct report has to ask for this too. I could go back to Dan. Hey, Dan, we talked 3 weeks ago that I need to do better on this. I've been really working on that. Have you noticed in the last couple of meetings, or have you noticed that, what have you seen? Okay. And so that will tell you two things. Is one, you're not giving enough informal feedback to your direct reports. And two, that you've done the right thing. Because now, if John's willing to come back to Dan and do that, that Dan has set the culture and the environment that's okay to do and encouraged, okay? So all of that informal dialogue is then what really sets you up to do number 3, which is the formal feedback. And all I mean by formal feedback is that, that's gonna be HR saying at this time, kind of using this format, we're gonna do that. As you know, we've set this up for once a quarter, and it's important to have that acknowledgement of, I gave you feedback, you received the feedback, okay? It doesn't mean you agree with the feedback, okay? It means you got it, okay? But because this is so hard to do, right, we want to have a way to kind of, frankly, force people to do it, right? To document that you've sat down and done it, okay? So that's my thoughts on feedback. If you do those 3 things, you'll start to get better at it. And it is not on the leader to do this. This is very much a bi-directional thing. And the more you set the environment that your direct reports are comfortable asking for feedback, then the better this will get. And then I think a follow-on of the feedback is these 3 things. And I stole this from Gartner. Imitation is the most sincere form of flattery, or plagiarism is the most sincere form of flattery. I forget which one it is. But there was an article I read, and it was about get, give, grow. All right, and these are 3 questions you should ask yourself, These are 3 questions you should understand about your direct reports. But it goes like this: what do I get out of working here? Okay, because at the end of the day, right, it's what's in it for me, right? We all love the company, we all want to do well, but there certainly has to be a component of what do I get out of this? What do I get out? Do I get the satisfaction of working? Am I really fired up about the mission continues? Do I really get a lot out of the group I work with? Do I get a lot out of the fact that I don't have to commute back up to DC every week right now? You know, what is it that I get out of my day-to-day work, okay? Because if you don't get anything out of your day-to-day work, then you aren't going to give as much, right? The more you get, the more you're going to give. The more you're going to give that 110%, the more you're going to give to, helping out a coworker who's having troubles. The more you are going to commit and really be invested in where the organization goes, all right? And then if you do those things, then you're going to grow, okay? You're going to grow in your job, and you're going to be able to think about, where do I want to go? Where do I want to be a year from now or 5 years from now, which, oh, by the way, should be a part of your feedback discussions. Where do you want to be 6 months from now? Where do you want to be a year from now? Where do you want to be 5 years from now? And so what defines grow is also different for everybody, right? Because some people have a desire to move horizontally. Some people have a desire to move vertically in the organization. Some people have a desire to grow into a job they know doesn't even exist at IronNet, okay? But I would rather, like with Andrew, if I know that his ultimate objective is to, to be a professional wrestler. Oh no, he's already done that. But if I know his ultimate objective is to be the Olympic wrestling coach, right? Then it is to my benefit to help him grow into that. I obviously have to get him to do everything I need him to do here. But if there are things that I can help you do, knowing that your ultimate objective doesn't have anything to do with working in a tech company, then I want to do that. Because if I know that I can create growth opportunities for you, even if they aren't directly related to the company right this minute, but they help you get eventually where you want to be. The best example of that is probably, as opposed to Olympic wrestling coaches, is education, right? So people are, maybe you're working in this particular job because, you got to pay the rent, it works out for you, all that stuff, but you're working at night or whatever to get educated in some completely different field, right? And that's where you ultimately want to go. If I can relate to you that I'm interested in all 3 of those things, I want you to have the right growth opportunities. I obviously hope they're in the company. I hope they're moving horizontally. I hope they're moving vertically. I hope they're staying a long time with the company. But I also understand not everybody's going to work at IronNet forever, right? And so I want to understand what your motivations and objectives are. But again, that goes back to trusted conversations with the team lead, right? Could I be comfortable going to my leader and saying, I really love working here, but this is not ultimately what I want to do, right? In 3 years, that's kind of the transition time for me, like there's a guy that works at our golf course and he's a great guy and all that, but we already know when his wife graduates from medical school next summer, he's moving, right? So there are life events, there are other things that trigger that. But this get, give, and grow, I really like as a construct, okay? And now, what's it take to be a good leader? I think, you can watch a lot of YouTube videos. You can sit in sessions like this. Watch, listen, and take notes, all right? And, I kid the Army, but Army officers, there's something in their culture that is instilled in them that most of them carry around these little green books. They're hard-covered books, and they are all the time taking notes. And a lot of them are taking notes about leadership, right? What do they see, and do they want to emulate that, right? Because I've always said everybody can serve as an example if only as a bad example, okay? So if you have aspirations of being a leader, right, you really have to watch, you have to listen, and you got to take notes, whether it's virtually, physical, whatever it is, and you should take notes on both sides. What does that person do that I really like, that was really effective with me? What did they do that I will never, ever do that, okay? Like I'll tell you the thing that I learned when I was a captain, which meant I was like 28 years old, that I said, if I ever get to be a wing commander, which I did twice, I will never do this. And what it was I passed a highly selective screening process to be like the project officer for the formal dining out event or something like that, So the wing commander called me up to the office, said, you need to come up and talk to the wing commander at 2 o'clock, and he's going to tell you what we're going to do at the dining out, what you should do, all that kind of stuff. So I show up at the office, of course, at whatever, 1:45, and I sit there, And at 3:30, he still hadn't called me in to talk to me. And he comes barreling out of his office and just walks right by and doesn't say anything, right? So what that told me was that person's time is more valuable to him than it is to me, right? So I said, I'm never going to leave people waiting. I'm always going to make sure that I value your time as much as my time. So whenever I came into a new organization, I said, this is a 10-minute rule. If I'm ever more than 10 minutes late to a meeting, leave, go away. You know, my joke in Okinawa was, it's an island, I can find you, okay? But I took that as something that I will never do. So I carried that throughout my career. I tried to always value other people's time, you know, as much as mine, okay? So watch, listen, and take notes. And then just do it. Some of you have heard me say this, beg forgiveness, don't ask permission. I mean, if kind of this, I'll give you my context of this, is that, think of it this way, right? Everybody has a lane in the road. The newer you are to the job or the more junior you are in the organization, usually the narrower the lane and the more well-defined the sides of the road. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. The more experienced you are, the more senior you are, the wider the lane and the less defined the sides of the road, mm-hmm. right? Kind of goes back, for those of you who did the situational leadership training we did about a year ago. You know, it's kind of like, you know, as you go from readiness level 1, 2, 3, and 4 up there, that it's similar types of things. I don't know what Patrick's high-fiving about. I can see him at Frederick, though. Hopefully it's something positive. But the situational leadership is, you know, same thing. If you are very new to this task, right, I'm going to have a pretty narrow lane, pretty bright sides, and I am going to be, like we talked about with Nicole, we're going to do A, B, C, and D. When you get done with A, come back and tell me, right? Okay, but people don't want to work that way very long. The way you want to work, right, is you want to have the vision, you want to know where we're going, you want to be appropriately motivated, and then you want to be turned loose to go get the job done, okay? And so I learned this in a couple of places. I'll just give you the 2 quick stories. Was one, when I was a major, which is a pretty junior position on these big staffs, I was working for a 2-star Navy admiral, and this plan I was working on, it was the Go Fight Iraq plan, is what it was at the time, but we would frequently be in briefing the 4-star Army general. And what really impressed me about this admiral was, we would be getting ready for a brief. He never came down to my desk and said, okay, go over all the slides with me, tell me everything about it. You know, he knew he didn't need to be as smart as me on it. That's why he had me working on it all the time, right? And we would go into the office, he'd go, hey, sir, Brett's going to brief you on this, blah, 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 and off we would go. Similar experience was when I was a squadron commander. Translation was that we had 24 F-15s, we had about 350 people, and this was back when we used to do, for those of you who remember the term, the no-fly zones. We would have to go to Saudi Arabia and make sure the Iraqis weren't flying over the southern half and the northern half of the country. So 24 airplanes, you augment the squadron up to about 450 or 500 people, and you got to take them over there, do the mission, and come back. And my boss at the time was a guy named, he became a 4-star general, but his name was Hawk Carlisle. And I'm getting the squadron ready, I'm doing all this, and I got to thinking, you know, General, as Colonel at the time, Colonel Carlisle, he never comes down and asks me how we're doing, are we ready, you know, all that kind of stuff. And when it came time to brief the wing commander, you know, about a week out, you go brief the wing commander, hey, here's what we're doing, here's where we're going. He said, are you ready? I said, yeah. And we go in and give the brief, right? And everything's fine, you know, and so that puts a lot of trust in you. Right? You get a lot of confidence in your ability. You know that leader is there if you have questions, that sort of thing, but that really tells you that there's a lot of trust. And so that starts to put you in this mode, which is, I think, where everybody would work. You don't want to be asking permission. Can I do this? Can I do this? You know, beg forgiveness, all right? Go in with that. And that came from, as young fighter pilots, you know, there's all these regulations about flying, and we used to argue, does the regulation tell you what you're allowed to do, or does it tell you what you are not allowed to do? You see what the difference is? And so, you know, the more we took the attitude that it says, it doesn't tell you what you're not allowed to do. If it's not in the reg, that must mean I can do it. Well, more and more things got put in the reg over time. But anyway, the point of that was, that's where that phrase came up, but I have applied it throughout my career. And, you know, I would tell the subordinate commanders that work for me, and I use the same thing here, as people will tell you that work with me here, was I want you to operate on this premise, okay? And to make that work, a couple of things have to happen. Is I've got to have trust in you, and I've got to basically know that you know how to do your job, and I've got to know I've communicated the vision, all of those things, right? And then if you make a decision to do something, you know, and this is certainly starts to play as you get into these, you know, this managerial chain, if you will, is that, you know, your boss is Sean, right? No.
Garrett Jones.
Oh, I'm sorry, Garrett, yeah. So your boss is Garrett, right? So what you would like to have is you would like to have Garrett let you operate under this philosophy: beg forgiveness, don't ask permission. And then if you make a decision that he's not happy with, right, for this to work, then he's got to, you know, and as I tell my commanders, I'd say, if you make a decision I don't like, unless it's back to illegal, unethical, immoral, or I'm 100% sure it's going to cause massive failure, I'm going to do everything I can not to reverse that decision. Because if I went down and reversed that decision that one of those subordinate commanders had made, what's that tell all the people that work for that person, right? They're not trusted, they don't have delegated authority, you know, all that sort of thing. And so I've told people over the years this never, I can't remember this ever bite me in the butt. There were certainly decisions made that I didn't agree with, but we would have a conversation in private. A lot of times the people already knew it was time to beg forgiveness. You know, the only thing I can tell you, if you're a leader and you're in the office 3 or 4 times a week begging forgiveness, then you probably ought to ask permission more frequently. But as a leader, that's how I want people to operate. And also, when you get here, this is how you delegate too. I think a lot of people that get into positions where they go, God, I'm working 14 hours a day and I'm going home and answering email. I'm doing this, I'm doing that. You know, unless you've just really been under-resourced, right? Then what's really going on is you're not applying this philosophy. You've trained people to come and ask you about everything, right? And you haven't gotten to a position where you've got delegated authority, people understand where they can go, and they're free to go forth and execute. All right. This is a leader, and who can identify this robot? Can anybody in the room? Lost in Space. See, Dan's closer to that generation. So does anybody know what Lost in Space is? Okay, your job is to go on YouTube and look for the robot from Lost in Space, okay? And he'll probably be near, what was the guy's name? The professor guy?
Yeah, Robinson.
No.
Oh, the woman?
No. We'll figure it out.
Dr. Smith.
What?
Dr. Smith.
Dr. Smith, there you go. George knows. He was always arguing with the robot. But anyway, my point of this is we've got all these discussions about robots, and robots are going to take over the world and all of that kind of stuff. Robots are not going to replace leaders, okay? What I can tell you is that there's a lot of jobs that are going to get displaced by robots, but leaders who provide vision, who provide motivation, who allocate resources, who give feedback, who understand how you want to grow, all of that kind of stuff, that requirement is going to exist, as near as I can tell, for the foreseeable future. And so while I think you're going to have to learn, one of the skills that will be required by 2025 is, can I work with an AI device, right? I'm going to have something that I'm working with that is doing some of the thinking I'm doing right now, right? Which talks to you about how do I have to evolve and how do I have to change. And so I would argue that if you want to future-proof your job, become a really good leader. And I'm not talking about your job, this particular job. If you want to future-proof your ability to make a living, maybe that's a better way to say it, become a great leader, okay? And then I found this website. I don't know if anybody's seen this. I don't know if I'll screw this whole presentation up by doing this, but you can search in here and you can put your job. So I put in Chief Operating Officer. And what are my odds? I've got a 0 chance of automation, right? So that doesn't mean I won't be fired tomorrow for poor performance, but you can go in here and put in your job and see what the chances are of you being replaced by a robot. So there you go. All right. Oops, let me see if I can get this worked out. Okay, so I'm going to open the floor for questions, but while you're thinking about questions, here's the feedback that I want you to do. When you walk out of here, pick up your phone, turn on the video selfie mode, and answer these 3 questions in less than 45 seconds, okay? Was this session a good use of your time? What was your biggest takeaway? And what are you going to do different in the next 48 hours? And then text that to me, okay? And about 90 people signed up for this, which means about probably 50 dialed in. So if I got 20%, if I got 10, I would consider that a victory, okay? But for everybody that did dial in, my sincere thanks. Hopefully you get from me that I'm pretty passionate about this subject. I've also really been somebody that's big into something called generativity, which is a term that was coined by a psychologist about 70 years ago, and it gets to people that have a desire to essentially train the people that will take your place, okay? And the first time that really struck me was, believe it or not, fighter pilots can develop egos, right? So over the first 8 or 9 years, my job was to be the best fighter pilot I could be. And then once I got to become an instructor, I found I took great pleasure in instructing the next person, right? And being able to see them excel and be able to do well. And then as I had more senior leadership roles, the Air Force put me in a position to mentor some of these courses and that sort of thing. And so I would highly encourage you to think about generativity, and it's not something that you wait and do when you're almost retiring. It's something you do right now, right? Because no matter what job you're in, you should be thinking about training your replacement or training the person that's going to work next to you, okay? And I think that's super important, okay? All right. So we've got a few minutes. If there are any questions, anything in here at Raleigh, other than you don't like the Duke picture? No?
Can you tell me about a time when you've had to lead a group of people who maybe they all had really big personalities, strong wills, just met each other, didn't work super well together? Like, can you tell me how you get people like that to work together harmoniously?
Well, I think first is you got to get them to work together, and then if you can get them to work together harmoniously, then that's a bonus. I thought when you said big egos, that's the only kind of people I worked with for a long time, was people with big egos. I think maybe the best example that I can give you is that that base I was talking about, Kadena. While it was an Air Force installation. There were a lot of other, we call them tenants. So there was an Army unit there that maintained these Patriot missiles, air defense. There was a big Navy presence there. There were a bunch of Marines, right? And when I got there, they just all unloaded on me about the crappy support, because it was our job to provide all the support to the crappy support and all that, And so what I did was I started having a meeting once a week. So I got the colonels that worked for me that were responsible for doing all this, and then on that side of the table I had all of those people, and I said, let's talk about what's going on, what's the problem, let's make sure, because we're all focused on the same objective, right? We got to project power in the Pacific and all that stuff. So to me, and they're all got egos, right? Because they're all commanders, they're all been very successful, all that stuff. But what I had to do was force them to hold hands and sit across the table. I had a similar thing when I was the ops group commander at a place called PSAT, Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia. So we had, getting ready for Iraqi freedom, that organization grew to about 200 airplanes and about 2,000 aircrew, and we were in what we called Ops Town, these little temporary buildings. So the F-15 people here, the F-16 people, the tanker people, and they would sit in their little buildings sniping about, oh, the tankers are idiots, the fighter guys suck, all that kind of stuff. And I would do the same thing. I would literally almost take them by the hand and say, walk them across the compound and say, let's go talk to the person you're having a problem with, right? And at least 90% of the time, you got to the point, just like you did with those people around the table, they go, oh, you're trying to do this? Oh, I was trying to do that. I didn't know you were trying to do that. What if we did this? Would that make it easier, right? So I think the answer is that you got to acknowledge everyone has their responsibilities. They're very capable and competent, but at the end of the day, it's not about each of you individually succeeding. It's about us succeeding. And I think forcing that communication and helping people really identify what are our common goals and what are our common objectives and why is it beneficial for us to work together. So, that makes sense? Yeah. All right, anything else here?
Going back to, better to ask for forgiveness.
Yeah.
How do you manage risk on a daily basis? How do you manage the decision you make? Obviously, you're going to make your decision, just go do it. How do you just manage that risk?
How do you manage that as the person that's deciding whether I should ask permission or beg forgiveness?
It's a dangerous statement.
As the leader, or
when you make a decision, right, and there's always risk involved, how do you manage your risk when making a decision?
Yeah.
So you're not begging for forgiveness at the end of it.
Yeah, well, I think you have to, if you have any doubt about what the goals and objectives set by your boss, whoever that is, if you have any doubt, then I would hedge much more towards the ask permission side, okay? The other thing is if you have any doubts, then go to your team lead but don't go and say, what should I do? Go to them and say, based on this, this, and this, I'm gonna do this, this, and this, right? And that lets them know that you're thinking about it and all that. And if they're applying this philosophy, they're gonna do what I think they should do, which is go, okay, John's thought about that, he's thought the problem, he wasn't 100% confident that this was something he should launch out on, but now I'm going to try to reinforce that so that that, be comfortable doing that in the future. So there's not a black and white answer to that. I think the less experience you have in the field, whatever, the lower your level of expertise is, and the less confident you are in the relationship with the team lead, right? Because either maybe it's a new team lead or something like that, then you definitely have to lean, more towards the other side, which doesn't mean you should ask permission for everything, but it's just, you maybe have to scope down how much you're willing to go, offline. But it's a classic risk reward, right? Because it's usually it's the riskier decisions that get the higher payoffs, right? And so, it's just like I was talking to somebody earlier today, is if the leader is saying, damn it, if this doesn't get done this way, heads will roll, right? Then that can tend to stifle innovation, all that sort of thing. And so, so a lot of it is the tone the leader sets, but I think if you kind of follow those two things, the less confident I am working with this particular leader, the more I'm going to be, a little more hesitant, and the less confident I am in my particular job. And frankly, it's a lot of times the school of hard knocks, because I've had times where I am extremely confident and know exactly what the hell I'm doing. And I had a boss, it really only happened once in my whole career, which is probably why I believe in this philosophy, that absolutely wanted to be what I call micro-informed, and so then sometimes then that drives you to exert a leadership style with your followers that you don't exactly like, but that's the cascading effect that can happen. So, sorry, I wasn't a clear black and white answer to that. But. All right, we got about 5 minutes. Is there anybody online? Anybody at Frederick have any questions, comments, BS flags, anything?
Hey Brett, this is Matt in Maple, and I've got a question. So I have a question about the distinction between like operational leaders and support staff leaders. And I experienced this in the Army, much less fancy and lower standards, but the Army's dynamic is the infantry versus the support staff, right? So why do you think operational leadership confers credibility, and does the why matter? And then follow up, do you think there's a parallel operational versus support staff leader dynamic at IronNet? And does like a churn or exchange mechanism need to be set up, or are we good there?
Yeah. So I think in answer to your first question, it's the people on the pointy edge of the spear that are always going to get the attention. And frankly, if the senior leadership of the organization does not try to drive a culture that really connects the dots from what everybody does to executing the mission, then it's going to be hard to get past what you say, Matt. On LinkedIn, I wrote an article about, or there was a piece of a podcast that was just published, and I talked about how do you connect the dots, and I talked about how commanders of support organizations, the ones that do it the best, help those people connect the dots from what they do, which may not seem that important to the ultimate objective of the mission. So it really is up to those leaders there. But I know what you're talking about. I think, because I've worked obviously with a lot of Army, a lot of Navy, I think the Air Force, frankly, when it goes overboard in the other direction sometimes, everybody's important, everybody needs to get a badge, everybody needs to get a cookie, some of that kind of stuff. I think the Army was sometimes the other direction, as you indicated. And I think a lot of times it just takes maturity, the leadership. And then I think that you know, like me going from being a fighter pilot to a cyber guy gave me a whole different perspective. And frankly, I was able to pass that perspective on to a lot of other leaders and have that impact. And so, so I think it can be tough. A lot of it has to do with the senior leadership of the organization. And as far as at IronNet, to tell you the truth, I don't, you know, I don't sense that right now, to be honest with you. When our company first started, there was kind of, you know, there were some terms thrown around about the people that are really bringing value to the company. Well, we wouldn't have anybody on the payroll if they weren't bringing value to the company, you know, and everybody has a different role. And, you know, of course I sit at a different level than you do, but I think that would be a healthy discussion if we think we do have, you know, we do have people that are, you know, well, you're really important, but, you know, you're not as important, because I frankly could take any job I've seen at IronNet and point it directly to, you know, a corporate level OKR, which, oh, by the way, is another reason OKRs were important. I think the alignment piece. But if you do see it differently, I would encourage you to talk to your, you know, talk to your boss, talk to me, because I think it's something that we do need to address, because everybody at IronNet should be able to connect the dots from what they do to the ultimate objective of the company. All right,
sir.
I could take one more question, if there is one, from anybody online.
I've got one. What was your biggest challenge in transitioning from, you know, a fighter pilot role to more of like a staffing position? You know, or transitioning from the command of Kadena to then, you know, the IT position, the J6?
Yeah, I think for, it's kind of related to Matt's question, because, and I see the same thing with software developers. Oh, I don't want to be a manager. I just want to write code. Yeah, I just want to write code. You know, fighter pilots, I just want to fly airplanes, right? But pretty soon you figure out that if you aren't willing to move into those leadership roles, you never have control of the resources. And if you don't have control of the resources, you can't really drive the direction of the, you know, of the organization. So I think most people figured out as they moved up the ladder that one, and it's no different in our company, right? That if you don't understand the role investors play, if you don't understand the role that, you know, managing the finances, you know, all of that takes to make the company run. Just like when I went to work on the Air Force budget, I go, God, somebody shoot me in the head, right? I'm going over to Congress, talking to these staffers. They're all idiots, you know, in my view, all that stuff. But that's the machine, right? And if you don't understand how the machine works, then you aren't going to be contributing to making the machine work better. You know what I'm saying? So I think you just had to get to that attitude of, hey, I've got to understand whether I like it or not. I got to understand how it works. Now, are there places I could change, things I could do different? Yep, I'm going to try to make that impact if I can. Other things I've just got to accept. Congress was going to have oversight, right? And so, you know, you have to be able to accept that and deal with it. But I think it is a certain level of maturity that says, hey, I'm going to go work in this other field, or I understand why it's important to take this other position, because it's not fun. It's not exactly what I want to do, but it's what I need to do. And it's where I'm going to maybe have the biggest impact.
Gotcha.
So, okay.
Thank you.
Okay, all right. 1 o'clock. I don't want to run anybody over. Please give me the feedback. And if you've got any other questions or want to hit me up offline, Slack, whatever, then do that. And again, thanks for attending, and thanks for seeing this discussion as being important to your time. All right, thank you, guys. All right, thanks, y'all.
Standing ovation only at
Yeah, we only do standing ovations.
Yeah. Like golf clap, light cheering and applause.
Makes you snap.
Yeah.
Drop the mic. Hey, Alexis and Alex. I think
Yeah, it's just kept from escaping me. That's why I want to put our recurring.
Hey, Brett, I have a question for you, but I won't be able to work it in my video.
Okay, all right, awesome.
Okay, sorry, I thought you were talking about the thing that we talked about.
I was just saying, it's, yeah, have them with everybody. I just forgot.